Hi, it's Tim Grant.
And Nikki McLeod from the Right and Wrongs podcast. This episode contains discussion of fraud and extortion. Viewer discretion is strongly advised.
Our discussion will, as always, include an in-depth analysis of how forensic linguistic techniques can play a role in unravelling the truth behind the story.
We hope you enjoy the show.
Righting Wrongs, an original podcast series from the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics. Season 3, Episode 3, The Case of Don Juan de Marin.
So Nikki, who do we have as our guest today?
So today, Tim, we have a very dear friend of the Institute. She's one of my favourite conference companions. We've got a lot of stories to tell. Getting abused by masseuses in Guangdong, nearly getting kidnapped in Mexico City, where I was very, very grateful to have not just a Spanish speaker, although that was life-saving, quite literally, but it was you. So I'm very, very happy to, I was very happy to have you by my side. So this is Spain's top forensic linguistics expert. She's consulted on in excess of 300 cases over the past 15 years and testified as a linguistics expert witness in criminal and civil trials across 10 countries. With cases reaching courts, including the European Court of Human Rights. Her work in forensic linguistics at ForensicLab continues through her laboratory based in Barcelona, which provides linguistic analysis of recorded conversations and voice messages, as well as written documents. So I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Sheila Queralt.
Thank you very much.
So, Sheila, you've worked on a range of cases, and the one we're going to talk about today is a romance fraud. We've heard about romance fraud before on the podcast. We had Lis Carter came in season 1 to talk about romance fraud. And this particular one that we're going to discuss today was a very complex one. It involved a perpetrator who adopted a number of different personas. And this is a kind of a concept that we discussed with DrEmily Chiang as well, when we talked about offenders kind of adopting multiple personas in order to just try lots of different techniques, I guess, with different people. We should mention really that the name of this episode is the Don Juan de Marin, because that's what the Spanish media nicknamed this case. But we need to keep in mind, obviously, that this case would have been quite a horrific experience for the victims. We don't want to trivialise that at all. And we mean absolutely not to minimise the seriousness of it with that name. So you report on this case in your chapter in the book Methodologies and Challenges in Forensic Linguistics Casework. So that's the book that was edited by Isabel Piconell, Rhea Perkins and Malcolm Coulthard. We're going to put the link to that in our episode description, so do go and check it out, Wrong'uns, if you're interested in hearing more.
Let's open the case file.
November 12, 2018, Madrid, Spain. 47-year-old Galician man Rodrigo Noguera Iglesias is arrested near the Puerta de Atocha railway station. He failed to attend court in Burgos for a trial where he'd been issued with a lengthy prison sentence. His crimes had stretched back more than 20 years. Rodrigo had frequented social media platforms and dating websites where he used fake profiles pretending to be different people with different names and professions, all with the initial goal of attracting the attention of women who could be potential victims. He'd pose as an haute cuisine chef, a tattoo artist, a technician for a major technology company, a hacker, and a long list of other professions. Once he gained the victim's trust, Noguera adopted a suitable persona and travelled throughout the country to meet the women in person and begin romantic relationships. Typically, he embellished his life story with a dramatic past in which his parents or sister had died in an accident, been victims of drug addiction, or even suffered from a terrible and prolonged illness. After forming an emotional connection came the moment when Noguera began asking the women for money or other valuables. There were even cases where the victims ended up buying him clothes or paying his rent. Furthermore, the con man managed to juggle several relationships simultaneously. He usually excused himself by saying he had a business trip to be able to move from one place to another. Little by little, the trips increased until, one day, he disappeared from their lives. It's estimated he preyed on in excess of 62 different women over the 20 years prior to his arrest, taking on at least 35 different identities, shaped to match each of his victims' preferences. Efforts to apprehend Nogueira stretched back a long time but hit a range of obstacles. Police investigations first started in 1996, and 4 law enforcement agencies had arrested Nogueira at different points in time, but the cases were dropped due to lack of evidence. In 2015, a group of his victims approached a private intelligence agency in an attempt to track him down and assemble enough evidence to prosecute him. Nogueira continued to evade justice though. He had no driving licence, so it was difficult to trace him through that means. He used aliases across social media. He never withdrew cash from his own bank accounts. He had no permanent address. He did not use any electronic devices registered in his name or linked to his own IP address, only public Wi-Fi networks. Then, the private detectives learnt of forensic linguistics. They contacted Dr Sheila Queralt for help.
So then, Sheila, as we've just heard there, you were approached by these investigators, these private investigators, I think, because they were struggling to locate this man. Do you want to tell us a bit about that, how they found you and what they had found up until that point, maybe?
Yeah, in this case, I was brought a bit later in the investigation. This private intelligence agency called On Branding was leading the case. And at the time, I was working alongside different police units. One of the officers that was involved in this case with Nogueira actually collaborated with me in a previous cold case, so he knew about forensic linguistics. And he thought that with all this material that they had, all this linguistic data, I could be helpful in this investigation. So following that, the agency reached me out and I joined the team as the forensic linguist. And I think this case really shows how important it is, this word of mouth in this world, in this field. So once people sometimes understand what forensic linguistics can do for them, how can they contribute to the investigations, they tend to come back. Normally, of course, police officers and not the clients, but agencies, lawyers, they really need to know how we can help them so they can keep on contacting us.
So this private agency, how had they linked all the cases together? The victims themselves, we heard in the case file, had found one another. Do you know anything about that? Because that sounds quite
Exactly.
interesting.
They found one another in different online chats and forums because it was a very big case. We are talking about 60 victims that filed him. Okay. But we know there is a lot more that they didn't know they were victims or they were afraid because he was threatening them. And then they all got in contact and then they approached this intelligence agency and then they started the bigger investigation in a private way.
Okay, and then they found you, which was lucky.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to hear some extracts from the data that you were given in just a little while. But before we get there, I wonder if it would be good if you could give us a bit of an overview maybe of what was actually provided. What did the investigators give you?
Yeah, the investigators provided me with emails and chat logs linked to 8 different online identities. They all believed to belong to the same person. What made this case particularly interesting is that the suspect was essentially acting like a chameleon. So he was adapting his identity, as you were reading before, depending on the victim. So he could be a technician, he could be a hacker. So not only would the profession change sometimes, but sometimes even the nationality he had played to be English or different other identities, and also the background he was presenting. So in terms of the data, some of the messages were very short, just a single email or a brief chat, while others were much longer, even over 1,000 words. So although the data set wasn't huge, it was varied enough to allow us to compare how language was being used across these different personas.
Okay, yeah. So I've got a table in front of me of the different sort of texts that you had. So we've got, for example, for one of the identities or personas, we've just got the one email, whereas for another, we've got an email, but also chat logs totaling 200,000 words in one case. A couple of chat logs there. So yeah, so quite some with more and others with a bit less. Yeah.
Okay, so you've got these emails and chat logs of different lengths and different amounts of data from the 8 different personas, and you're working for this private company, this private security firm. In what form did you come to have instructions? Did they give you really precise instructions like you might get from a solicitor, or was it a broader, can you just tell us anything you can? Or how did that process work?
The agency had a more broader, because they didn't know exactly what we could do for them. But actually, the police officer that I was working with before, he knew which questions he should make. So he came up with 3 main questions. First, whether all these different identities could actually be linked to the same person. In other words, are we dealing with one author or different authors? Mm-hmm. Then, if that was the case, they wanted to go a step further and build a sociolinguistic profile. Basically, what can we infer about the person behind the text? They wanted to know the gender, the languages he was speaking, the profession, all these kind of things.
So a sociolinguistic profile is, we have talked about profiles before on Writing Wrongs. So this is like a little pencil sketch of the nature of the person who is writing.
Exactly.
So yes, as you've said, their gender and age, but maybe also regional things or stuff to do with their profession or
educational background.
Yeah, all these things you're trying to glean from the text.
Exactly. That was particularly important because they had several suspects. So this kind of profile could help narrow things down because they had all these suspects. And finally, because the offender was still active at the moment, they needed something more operational in terms of police officers. So they asked for a set of recurring linguistic features, so patterns they could look out for in future messages. So it could help them to assess whether new text might belong to the same individual. And it's important to say here that this wasn't meant to replace the work of the forensic linguist, but rather to give them a preliminary tool to decide when to bring a forensic linguist back into the investigation. In those years, there was about 3 very active scammers in Spain. So they wanted to know if that was worth in that case or how should we do it. So they wanted this tool. I was a bit skeptical, to be honest, at that moment, because I was like, no, it needs to be trained people. But we talked about it. We got a consensus and okay, I did that tool.
That's a really interesting application, isn't it? So you've got the profile, which if they have a list of 30 or 130 people, they can say, well, this portion of it actually match your profile, and that reduces the search for the offender. But then also this idea of looking for future texts and saying, well, if it's got this stuff in, it might then link. And I don't think I've ever done that. I have created my own feature lists and done author search where I'm trying to find the person in a large number of authors, but this sort of prospective analysis, that's a really interesting application.
So just to summarise then what they asked of you, we've got this kind of potential linking of the texts, also developing a linguistic profile such that we might spot this authorial style basically in future texts that have not yet been produced. So with a task like this, with a set of questions like this, where do you start?
I started by analyzing each set of text separately, like treating each identity as if it belonged to a different person. At that stage, I was mainly looking at 3 levels: vocabulary, grammar, and pragmatics. So not just the words were used, but how sentences were structured and how meaning was expressed in context. The key idea behind this is that the way we use language is not random. It reflects things like our age, the education, geographical background, and even aspects of our social identity. That was very important in the case. What I was doing was identifying patterns at each of these levels and then looking at how consistent those patterns were across the different identities. Because even if someone is trying to adapt or disguise their style, which was clearly happening in this case because he was a chameleon, there are usually underlying features that remain stable. And that consistency is really what allows us to link text and build a profile.
That's really, really interesting because it links into our last episode of Writing Wrongs, where Emily Chang was talking about multiple personas. And one of her findings was for most of the personas, the individual was quite constant in their language use, whether they were playing a man or a woman or an older person or a younger person or someone from a different background. They didn't vary very much at all across all those different personas. So you were, in a sense, depending upon that in this analysis, I guess. So through the analyses of the vocabulary use, the word choice, the grammar, and the pragmatics, how the language was being used, you've come up with your profile. I think we should hear some extracts now. And perhaps you can, we're going to hear the extracts in Spanish, and then maybe, Sheila, you can provide, for the non-Spanish speakers amongst us, you can provide a bit of a gloss of what was said, but also talk through the information this gives you and helps you build that profile.
No soy un niño estúpido y llorón.
I'm not a stupid and whine child.
Esa es buena, porque yo sí estoy depilado.
That's a good one because I'm waxed.
Yo soy otro insociable.
I'm another antisocial.
Okay, so we've heard the extracts there, and that middle one was great. So you've translated that as, that's a good one because I'm waxed. Does that mean what I think it means?
Yeah, that doesn't have any hair.
Okay, excellent. So could you profile that from the language? Who knows? Okay, so tell us a little bit about what you can deduce from the language use here in terms of the information that helps you build a profile.
So Spanish is a gender language, so many words change from depending on whether you are presenting yourself as a male or a female. So typically ending the words in O, it would refer for masculine, and A for feminine. So for example, you might say guapo if you're a male, or guapa if you are a female, beautiful it means. So that final vowel carries information about your identity. What we see in this text is very consistent across all the different identities. The author uses masculine forms ending in O, with no exception, when referring to himself, and never the feminine forms. So even though he's clearly acting like this chameleon thing and adapting his persona, there's one feature that doesn't change. And that's really important because in forensic linguistics, we are always looking for what stays stable beneath the variation. And here, that strongly points to a male author. We have seen other cases, for example, in which they are trying to disguise their own gender. And they are not consistent because it's used in adjective, in nouns. I mean, it's very difficult in Spanish to keep consistent and not make a mistake.
So are all the personas male?
Yeah.
Yeah, so, but you were wondering, at least open to the hypothesis that it might be a woman who was the con person.
There was male victims, we know, but he was still using a male identity always.
Okay.
So you also made some observations about the purported age of the writer, and a lot of that was based on a kind of a content analysis rather than a linguistic one. So you're looking at the sort of the activities that were discussed and that kind of stuff. But then you move on to discuss certain linguistic features that might point to age. So we're going to hear some more clips of that now.
Si me pongo chulo y ególatra prepotente.
If I get all cocky and egomaniacal and arrogant.
Yo con mi talante, con mis movidas virtuales.
Me with my good mood, with my virtual stuff.
Joe, como mola.
Damn, that's so cool.
Todo me suena pitorreo.
It all sounds like jerking around to me.
Me huele a moho y a mal rollo.
I sense mold and bad feelings.
What did we hear there, Sheila?
There are informal expressions that are typically associated with younger adult speakers, roughly between 20 and 40 at the time, because of course now the 20s and 40 people speak differently.
Older, yeah.
Sorry, and also some of these texts were from much earlier than when you were doing your analysis.
Exactly.
So it's at the time for the writer as well. So if this was 10 years later, you're saying they were 20 to 40 at this time.
Yeah, and that's very, very important. We said around 2004, 2007, when the texts were produced, he was between 20 and 40 years old. But it's not just about language itself here. We also look at the content, the kinds of activities he mentioned, the music groups. He's skating, he says sometimes, which are more typically of younger profiles. And at the same time, we don't take what the author explicitly says about his age at face value, of course, because that can easily be manipulated. We know that. So what we do is to combine those different layers, language, style, and content. And see whether they all point into the same direction. And in this case, they do.
And you make some observations about the writer's educational level as well, don't you? So partly based around his description of piano playing And I'm learning piano very, very slowly at the moment. So I thought this was interesting for me. And what you say is he doesn't match the knowledge expected of a professional musician. So like me, I couldn't pass myself off as a professional in that domain. But he does claim to be a professional musician in the conversation. So can you elaborate on these kind of educational and activity features?
Yeah, this is where things got really interesting. Actually, it was the victim that she was also a piano player that said that doesn't match, it's not real. But on the one hand, the author tries to present himself as highly educated. He uses quite sophisticated vocabulary and makes reference to things like this classical music. But when you look more closely, there are inconsistencies. For example, in the piano extract, he claims to be a professional musician, but the way he describes his practice is actually very vague and quite superficial. And it doesn't match the level of detail you would expect from someone with that kind of expertise. What we see is a mismatch between the identity he's trying to project and the linguistic evidence.
Yes, and when you get that kind of mismatch, that's exactly the kind of thing that we're looking for, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as well as his comments on piano playing, you talk in the chapter about some ungrammatical constructions pointing potentially to the author not having completed higher education. So can you talk us through that? What gave that impression?
Yes, so alongside that, we also see some ungrammatical constructions. For example, he says in Spanish, hasta el pelo me va blanqueándose, which roughly means even my hair is turning gray. But the form used there isn't quite standard in Spanish. And we also see mistakes in English when he has this English persona, where he's essentially spelling words the way they sound. For instance, spelling loses with U instead of the O, or with or welcome with double L, which suggests a more phonetic approach to spelling. So again, what we have is that contrast. On the one hand, he's trying to project a certain level of sophistication, but on the other hand, this kind of errors suggest a more limited level of formal education.
Yeah, one of the things I teach our students of forensic linguistics is you can always attempt, however badly, to project a persona that is lower than your educational level, but it's really, really hard to project a persona that is above your own educational level. And this sounds like what you're saying is that's what he's trying to do and sort of failing at.
Yeah, and that's rare because, as you say, normally when people try to discuss, they use a lower level because it's easy. Of course, everybody would like to write like someone very famous. And
So they put in misspellings as if they're uneducated, but what we probably know is they put the misspellings in the wrong way and in the wrong places and so on. But yeah, so this is a little rarer maybe. And so as well, so we've talked about gender and education level, but you also had some specific geographical insights from the language used. What we've got now are some examples that are consistent with Spanish spoken in the northern and centre of Spain, rather than, say, in Barcelona or the other parts of the south of Spain. So let's just listen to those.
Muchos besitos.
many kisses.
Se la suele oír bien, excepto si habla bajito.
She is usually easy to hear, except when she speaks softly.
Okay, so what's about those forms that point to a region or place in Spain?
In these examples, we hear features are typical of native Spanish speakers, and more specifically of varieties spoken in northern and central Spain. For instance, words like besitos or bajito use that ito ending, which adds a softer or a more affectionate tone, a bit like saying liter or dear in English. And that's quite common in those regions. So it's specifically endings that we use differently in other varieties.
Okay, so what would it be if it was a southern Spanish variety? What would it be more like?
Vecinos, you can say as well, vesicos. So
it's this sort of diminutive form or suffix that varies depending on where you are from in Spain. And this version is ito, ITO as the ending rather than these other options.
Yeah, these ones are from central or northern Spain.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And what about the indirect object singular pronoun? There was something there about that. The use of la. Was there something with that?
Yeah, we also have different structures, like for example in se la suele oír bien, this la, se la suele oír bien, it's used where standard Spanish would normally use a different pronoun. Normally it would be le instead of la. Something that linguists call laísmo. It has a specific name, and which is particularly associated with central Spain, including areas like Madrid. So we are going into Spain with diminutive and then also with this pronoun. It's a combination, again, and the consistency of these features that allow us to link the language to a particular geographical area.
And keeping on the topic of geographical sort of location, you go on to talk about some choices in the text that are consistent with interferences from Galician. So this is a Romance language spoken in the northwest of Spain. So we'll hear a couple of examples of that.
Te diré que hoy hablamos por teléfono, que te llamé yo, que te dije que seguía siendo tu gatito y que te seguía queriendo.
I will tell you that we spoke on the phone today, that I called you, that I told you I was still your kitty and that I still loved you.
La putada es que no consigo localizar a Manuel, que debe estar trabajando.
The fact up is that I can get hold of Manuel, who must be working.
So, Sheila, what's going on in those extracts?
Yes, in addition to what we have already said about this geographical variety, we also see signs in these sentences of influence from another language, in this case Galician, which is also spoken in northern Spain. And for example, in one of these extras, he says something equivalent to "we spoke today," where standard Spanish would typically use a form closer to "we have spoken today."
Okay.
And these kind of choices, along with others, suggest that the author is likely in contact with Galician or comes from a region where both languages are used.
So that's interesting because there is some evidence, at least, that that present perfect form is more common in British English than American English. Yeah. And so it is one of the things that you can look for to separate out the region of English speakers that someone is from, and there's some mapping of that, I'm aware, in a fairly recent research article. So in this case, you've got the language contact with Galician rather than two varieties of English. But again, these small cues and clues in the language can help with this regionalization, certainly.
Is there anything else going on in those extracts, Sheila?
Yeah, we have another thing in how that influence shows up in different parts of the language. We see it not only in how verb forms are used, but also in small details like spelling. For example, words that in standard Spanish would normally carry on an accent mark are written without it, like quién, who, with an accent versus quién without one, or prácticamente, also without the accent. Now, that's not just random error. These forms actually match how these words are written in Galicia, where accent marks are used differently. So what we are seeing is not just incorrect Spanish, but traces of another linguistic system influencing the writing.
Mm-hmm.
Overall, then, the overall picture, you've got a fair bit of potential information about the writer, the background of the author, and so on. Was there anything else, perhaps, that you couldn't draw quite as firm conclusions about?
Yeah, there were a couple of additional details, but with a much lower level of certainty. For example, some lexical choices hinted at a possible connection to the sea, phrases like anchors or ballast appearing in different messages. There was also a more metaphorical reference that could suggest eye color, something along the lines of with grey eyes. He always described himself as with grey eyes. But in both cases, the evidence was very limited, so they were treated as tentative observations, let's say, rather than firm conclusions, and simply shared with the investigators in the case if they were useful alongside other kind of evidence, of course.
Okay, so just to sort of kind of summarise where we've got to so far, we've linked the authors, we've talked through the things that these 8 personas that they have in common. So we've got this kind of shared profile, I guess. Now, how did you go about tackling this third question? So they've asked for a list of linguistic features that are especially characteristic of the author so that perhaps they can spot them in future cases.
Yeah, so instead of giving them a full analytical framework, which requires, of course, a specialist training, I provided a checklist of recurring and distinctive features. The idea wasn't them to carry out a full linguistic analysis themselves, but to have something practical, essentially like a set of red flags that we all talk about now. So if few messages appeared, they could quickly check whether those features were present. And if so, that would indicate it was worth bringing in a forensic linguist again. Importantly, The checklist focuses on features that are easy to spot, what we might call visually salient features, things you don't need linguistic analysis or training to notice. For example, repeated constructions. Sometimes he's added the emails with the same constructions. Punctuation habits, where does he place a comma, for example, or very characteristic expressions. It also included simple interaction patterns, how he says agreement, for example, okay, vale, different things, like how he would build up to asking for money. He had some special tricks there. And the idea was that if several of these features appeared together, that would signal it was worth bringing in a forensic linguist or a full analysis. A bit like, okay, this is the moment to bring a forensic linguist. CSI.
Yes, absolutely. So you've done this body of linguistic work, and Nogueira was identified by the police investigation, I understand. And then you got an opportunity to do some comparisons with his actual writing and the writings from the anonymous and possibly disputable author of these messages. So you've got the known text of what he actually wrote and these ones. So can you talk through the sort of the profile information and the real writings of Nogueira?
Yeah, the police got him, so he had different profiles in his computer, a victim's computer that he was using. So we had all these known profiles. We knew that it was him, so we made the comparison. Yes, everything matched. So
just to be clear, so you've got a victim's computer, and on that computer, he has a variety of these profiles from which he is writing to other victims.
Yes.
Lovely.
Normally, he had between 2 or 3 different at the same time victims, because sometimes when the victim knew that she was a victim of this scammer, then he changed it and moved to another house.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so talk us through some of those comparisons then.
When we compare the linguistic profile with the actual details, meaning the information confirmed during the investigation once the suspect was identified, the level of alignment is actually striking. We correctly identified the author as male, and we were also very accurate on his geographical background. The analysis pointed towards Galicia, but also suggested this contact or exposure to central varieties of Spanish, which fits perfectly with the fact that he was originally from Galicia, but had lived in Madrid for a long time. The educational level matched as well. The linguistic evidence suggested a more basic level, which was consistent with the real profile. He didn't do any kind of studies. Age is actually a good example of how important timing, as you said before, is in this kind of analysis. We estimated the author was between 20 and 35 around 2004 when those texts were produced, and that aligns very well with the fact that he was 42 at the time he was arrested in 2018.
So in 2004, he would have been...
It's
just put you on the spot to do a bit of maths there.
It's about 30 years old.
Okay.
Even some of these, of the more tentative observation, actually, like reference to the grey eyes or to the sea, the connection, turned out to be accurate. So overall, the profile held up remarkably well, but not because linguistic analysis gives you certainty about everything. We need to know that profiling, it's not always 100%. But because when the patterns are consistent, it can provide a surprisingly reliable picture of the person behind the text.
Okay, so putting all that together, how was this analysis, your analysis, how was it put to use? What was the outcome?
Well, in this case, everything was used at the investigation stage rather than in a formal report. But it's very common in profiling. Normally it's during the investigation, but we don't go to the court with a report. I was working directly with the investigators, and the profile helped them make sense of the data and narrow things down, especially as new profiles kept appearing because the offender was very active and kept creating new identities. The checklist was also useful because it gave them something quick to look at. Like, does this feel like the same person? And if it did, that's when they would bring me back in. And in terms of the outcome, the suspect was eventually identified, arrested, and what's really interesting is that the linguistic profile matched him quite closely. It didn't solve the case, the linguistic analysis on its own, but it definitely helped move the things forward.
Okay, and you talk in the conclusions to your chapter, you talk about the limitations of the methods, and obviously any approach will have its limitations. So can you talk us through that, both in terms of the constraints about how you were able to approach the problem and the obstacles in terms of the broader investigation?
Yeah, I think this is very important to be clear about. And sometimes experts are a bit afraid of saying the limitations of their own analysis. But I think it's very important to be clear about what we can do and we cannot do. And linguistic profiling very rarely ends up in court, in Spain at least, or Latin American countries, it's the same.
Yeah, it doesn't in the UK either. Yeah.
Okay.
Just used at investigative stages, isn't it? Yeah.
So most of the time it's used during the investigation to guide the decisions, not as a formal evidence. And there are also clear limitations. We don't always have the kind of large representative data we would ideally want, like, for example, in the academic investigation. So we have to be very careful about how far we go with our conclusions. For example, when we had this gray eye, so we can say it, we can tell to the investigators, but be careful because maybe it's not true. And there are also practical constraints. You are often working with this partial data and you don't always get to see the full picture. So it's a powerful tool, but it has its boundaries. And I think the key point is that it's not about giving definitive answers. It's about helping the investigation in the right direction, to going in the right direction. Because my conclusion is that language doesn't prove everything, but it almost always leaves traces if you know how to read them.
Yes. Yeah. One of our slogans is that every sentence leaves a trace.
Okay.
So that's part of writing wrongs, which is that. Before we move to the close, can I just ask, so in this case, it was an investigative use. You didn't provide evidence for the courts in Spain. But I'm right in thinking you do go to court in Spain sometime on other cases where the structure of the case is a bit different. And so you do provide evidential reports in the Spanish system.
Yeah, very often. Too much.
Too much, maybe. Yeah, I just thought it was worth getting that in because one of the things we're interested in with our guests is, in your jurisdiction in Spain, how is forensic linguistics used? Is it very common in Spain, or is it rare? Are you the only person who's called? Tell us a bit about that.
It's worth pointing out for our listeners as well that whereas we have in England and Wales the adversarial system, so if you go to trial, you've got two sides kind of opposing each other and trying to kind of construct alternative versions of events. On the continent, they have an inquisitorial system, which works very differently and is much more kind of focused on a party looking into the facts, really. Is that a fair summation?
It should be.
Right.
But it's changing. We're getting very American or English. So it's getting more adversarial in court. Yeah, and forensic linguistics is not common, let's say, like that many people don't know about it. But we are having a lot of casework. A lot of lawyers know it. Police forces know us. So we are really doing a lot of work. So we need more people. If someone is hearing us and they want to join us, we would be glad to have them. So it's very, I would not say very common, but it's quite common in Spain.
Okay, so a call out for Spanish-speaking forensic linguists to get in contact with Sheila. That's great. Can I just one follow-up question about that? So if it is for evidential work, who is it that commissions that work? Is it the police investigators, or is it the court, or someone else?
It could be the court, it could be the police forces, and it can be private clients.
Okay.
Most of our clients are private. Normally, police forces, it should be more criminal cases, which are not the most common in Spain. In our area, it's more like civil cases. We have a lot of domestic violence cases, discourse analysis with minors, for example, but also analysis of questions and things like that.
Okay.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much, Sheila. Thank you for coming and speaking about this case. It's a fascinating case, and I think it's really given listeners a kind of bit of an insight into the workings of a forensic linguistic analysis and an understanding, I guess, of how it can support investigations and improve the delivery of justice, which is what we're all about here at Writing Wrongs.
And it's great to hear, as always, from another jurisdiction, another country, and how forensic linguistics is growing there. So thank you so much, Sheila, for coming in.
Thank you to you. It has been a pleasure.
If you've got a question, remember you can get in touch with the show via email, writingwrongs@aston.ac.uk.
If you've been affected by any of the themes in this week's episode, please consider contacting the resources in the episode description.
This has been Writing Wrongs, an original podcast series from the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics at Aston University. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Goodbye.